This happened about a year ago, during the summer. I work at a local family-owned grocery store that has its own package store. With a package store comes a bottle return room, and ours is particularly small, with only 2 machines, that, may I add, jam and break fairly easily. We're located next to a gas station/convenience store, so we get our fair share of strange, creepy men who love to make young women feel uncomfortable and purposely break our bottle machines so the girls have to fix them as they watch. We also get a handful of regulars, since we're a local shop, and unfortunately many of our regulars are those creepy, perverted men. Our bottle room is where the story starts. It was a Saturday night, around 8 o'clock. We close at 10 on Saturdays, so although it was summer, it was dark outside once we left work. One of our regulars, I'll call him Jim, came in to return some bottles. Jim is a slightly older, probably in his 50s, short man who smelled of sweat and beer and loved to sing while returning his bottles. He didn't seem to be as creepy as most of the other men that come in, but I was always cautious around him. Naturally, my co-worker, I'll call him Nick, and I got a call at the registers letting us know the bottle machines were jammed. Nick volunteered to go unjam the machines, since he knew who was behind the call. Nick comes back to the front after a few minutes and everything is completely normal. He helps a few customers out and waits to see if Jim will come to the front before telling me he is going to fill the milk and egg shelves in the cooler, protocol for closing the store. It doesn't take too long to restock the milk and eggs, maybe 10 minutes on a night where the shelves are very empty, but Nick came back within 2 minutes. After he ringing up another customer, he told me, Jim was asking to see you, personally, so just a heads up. Despite the gross feeling that gave me, it wasn't out of the ordinary for Jim to say that. Nick cleared his throat and then said quickly, oh, and he had a machete, so there's that too. Now, weird shit going down in the bottle room isn't unusual, but I can say I have never seen or even heard of a customer carrying a machete in any store. I suggested we call the police, but Nick told me he wasn't threatening anyone with it, he was putting it back in his backpack, so the cops probably wouldn't do much. I shrug it off for the most part, as I trusted Nick, but still keep it in the back of my head to watch out for Jim. 10 or 15 minutes goes by and there was no sign of Jim anywhere, so I figured it was safe for me to assume he had left and would redeem his bottle slip another time. The next hour and a half goes by smoothly and we are getting ready to close our registers and lock our doors, when I see someone run by the floor-to-ceiling windows at the front of the building, which is behind our registers, so while I am working on the register my back is to the windows. I shrug it off again but am still wary and decided to keep myself on high alert and return to my closing business. Out of the corner of my eye I see the same person run by the sliding doors, to my left, tripping the motion sensor, causing the doors to open. I recognize the person as Jim. At this point I am getting slightly nervous and tell Nick that it was close enough to 10 p.m. for him to lock up. He goes and locks the doors and I see Jim run by again, totally ignoring Nick. We finish closing and Nick shuts all the lights off but I tell him not to leave yet because I was feeling even more nervous about Jim running around outside. As a side note, Jim wasn't just leisurely going for a run around our store. He was pacing, almost like he was circling our store waiting for us to come out. I let Nick know that I was very unnerved by this, especially since I hadn't driven to work that night and my mother wasn't there to pick me up. He said it would be okay from inside of the store and we just needed to wait it out. We were waiting in the aisles of the store watching Jim closely, when I noticed a gleam of light reflecting off of something in his hand. It was his machete. I texted my mom to tell her to park right in front of the back door so I could jump straight into her car when she got there. When Nick and I deemed it safe enough to leave, we took the opportunity and booked it out of there. I saw Jim at the front of the store as my mom and I drove off, and I can definitely say that event sticks out to me as the most unsafe I've felt at work. I can't tell you why we didn't call the police. I guess I trusted Nick enough to also trust his word against calling them, but looking back I think it was dumb of us not to call them. Some things to add: I was a 17-year-old girl at the time of this event, and knowing that Jim was asking for me personally, that situation had the potential to get a whole lot worse, especially since we decided not to call the police. I also don't know the laws for carrying weapons in the town I live in, or at my place of work, so I'm not sure if it was illegal to have it on the property of the store, let alone carry it. So Jim, one thing is for sure, I would really like if we never met again, especially if you are carrying that machete. This story isn't as scary as most of the ones here, but it's the most unnerving thing that has ever happened to me. When I was about 17 or so, I had moved back home to the beach after staying out in WA for a bit after earning my get. Not long after I got back I made some new friends, with one in particular, Chris. This story isn't about him, but how meeting him was probably the worst thing that could have happened. Now, we used to hang out all the time and smoke weed, drive around aimlessly, go out to bars, etc., just your everyday teenager stuff. We were, however, pretty into urban exploration, I guess you could say. We used to go into the woods all the time in random places just to explore. We live in a big city, so there isn't much adventure in the concrete jungle. Anyway, one night we're driving along this huge stretch of road, one city over, Chris, B, a female friend, and myself. It's probably about 7:30 p.m. in the middle of summer. There are usually street lamps in most parts of the city, but it was pitch black, with thick woods on either side of the street. The sun hadn't set yet, but you couldn't see anything below the tree line. Chris decides to tell us about this path in the woods that connects to neighborhoods he used to use as a kid, and how it's a cool spot to smoke up with rope swings and benches and stuff. So of course, we're like, yeah, let's go. We make our way into the woods down the only path we can see, and it's well beaten, a clear sign it's used often. I never worried about weird things happening because, you know, they always happen to someone else. As we got to the bench in the middle of the path, we sat down and rolled up. B was making a spectacle of playing on the rope swing that hung out over a ditch that was about 6 feet or so deep. So we finish rolling up, and have two really nice blunts lit up, and we're just sitting there bullshitting, having a good time. And out of nowhere, the air seemed to get really thick. It's hard to explain, but my throat started getting tight, it was harder to breathe, I started getting lightheaded for seemingly no reason at all. It took me a minute to realize what I was feeling was dread. Just sheer terror, and I didn't know why. Before I could even ask my friends if they felt it, we heard footsteps, and no sooner did we take notice that 3 men were standing within 5 feet of our circle. Now it's pitch black, we have no lights, just the cherry of our lit smoke. These men look like nothing but shadows in the dark, we can't see their faces, clothes, anything. It was extremely unnerving to say the least. After what felt like forever, one of them spoke to us. "Hey, what are you guys doing out here so late?" I answered them, "Oh, we're just cutting through and stopped to smoke up. Mind if we join you?" Now, obviously it would have been better to tell these guys to fuck off, but I didn't want to set anyone off. So, I told them yes. I don't think things would have gone differently if I had told them no. Anyway, so one of them sits next to us on the bench and just starts small talk, asking things like, "What do you guys do for work, where you from, etc." His wasn't polite small talk, it was like he was trying to keep us distracted, which I didn't notice at the time. He kept talking as he gave one of our blunts to his friend, who I'll remind you haven't said a word and didn't sit either. The other 2 just stood next to the bench, looking like they were waiting for something. I passed the other blunt to our new friend, just hoping they are just trying to get a free smoke out. I couldn't have been more wrong. No sooner than the 3 men have both of our smoke, do they all get really stiff, like statuesque, and reach into their pockets, and you guessed it, all 3 of them were armed. Now I'm standing there thinking that they just wanted our weed, and didn't want us to argue about it. Then came the very stereotypical, "Now, give me everything you have." as guns were drawn and literally put within an inch of my face. I could almost look straight down the barrel. Damn the darkness, I was so close to it. I just stood there. I didn't move at all. I guess I was kind of in shock, like I really didn't believe what was happening. Then out of nowhere, the man to my left let a round off right next to my ear. Now, if you think a gunshot is loud when you hear it on your street, you have no idea how loud it is when it goes off right next to your head. I jumped about 10 feet, and rushed to empty my pockets. I gave them my phone and my wallet, without hesitation. My friends followed suit and I thought that was the end of it. We weren't so lucky. This did nothing but make them even madder. They were pissed they only got 2 cell phones and maybe $40 from 3 people. Since our car was still parked out on the street, they assumed we must have had more valuables inside. One of the men grabbed Chris by the collar of his shirt and told him that he was going to walk them to the car, and let them take what they needed. B and I of course protested and were met with more guns in our faces. 2 of the men took Chris out to the car while the third looked at us and said, "Now, I'm going to walk halfway up the path and find me a nice bush to lay low. If either of you try to run or do anything smart, I'll be waiting with a bullet." And he walked down the path after Chris and the other men. B and I stood there in the middle of the woods in complete silence for a good long while. We talked about how good our chances were, if we tried to make a run for it, and ultimately decided against it. We weren't sure if the guy was bluffing or if he really was waiting in a bush to shoot us. It felt like we were there forever, and out of nowhere, 3 more gunshots ring out from the street. B lost it. She just started bawling right there in the woods, sobbing at the thought of Chris being murdered. I tried my best to console her, and almost strangled her at the same time. When I leaned in to hug her, I could see the light from her phone in her back pocket that she refused to give up. We used it to call 911 but never put the phone to our ear. We just called, and put it back in her pocket while talking about the situation. We were scared the guy in the path would see the light if we kept it out too long. We waited there in the woods for an eternity before we started seeing flashlights and hearing the barking of dogs. It was the police. I couldn't have been more relieved, and neither could B. She started sobbing all over again, and we walked out of the woods with the cops. They took B to the side, while they zip-tied me and put me in the back of a police cruiser. I started staring out the window, wondering why and where they took B, before I noticed Chris was sitting next to me. I started crying myself, out of relief that he was alive and wondering what happened when they got to the street. He told me that they brought him to the car and had him let them in. He said he let them take whatever they wanted, which still wasn't much in terms of sellable. He said they got pissed, and hit him, then shot off a few rounds before running into the woods on the opposite side of the street. I asked him if he told the cops that, and he said they wouldn't listen. It didn't take me long to find out why. They pulled me out of the car after talking to B, and I insisted they remove the zip ties if I wasn't being arrested. Why should I? Apparently, the police thought that B was in danger of US. Granted, I realize now they were only being diligent, but at the time I was not only offended but pissed off. They thought that Chris and I were back there trying to rape B or something just as heinous. It was pretty shocking that they straight up accused us of sexually assaulting her in the woods and refused to listen about the men. That is, until B calmed down enough to tell them the same thing we did. Eventually they believed us, but it was too late since it had been almost an hour since the men took off into the woods. They told B that she could drive her car home, but because Chris and I were adults they wouldn't allow her to give us a ride back. So, I asked the cop if he would take us home, and he declined, and not politely either. It was pretty clear they thought we weren't being 100% truthful about not messing with B in the woods. The cops left us there, standing in the middle of the road in pitch black darkness, woods on either side, after being robbed at gunpoint and the men probably still close by. I have never been that terrified in my entire life. We started walking down the street. I think we must have walked for a good 5 miles, the entire time glancing over our shoulders, scanning the tree line. Every time we heard any sort of noise we jumped, and just stood still. Eventually we came to a main road, and could see a shopping center not far off. These were usually patrolled by security at night, so we thought it was our best bet. We get up to one of the main stores, a Dollar General, and scanned a lot of any type of security, and there was nothing. Not one car in the entire lot. Now, these were back in the days of payphones, and luckily there was one right outside. I got on my knees to scan the underside of a soda machine and found just enough to make one call. We called Chris' brother, and thank God he was awake and agreed to come get us. I don't think I had ever been so relieved to get into a car in my life. He got us home safely, and all I could think about was if I would be deaf in my left ear forever, while trying to stop shaking. I lost my first cell phone I ever had, a new lost wallet, and almost my hearing, but I'm extremely glad I'm still alive despite everything. So, creepy men in the woods stalking teens and robbing them, let's never meet again. When I was 10 years old, my mom was in a stable, long-term relationship with a man who I considered to be a better father than my own. He'd had a hard time with drugs in the past, but he'd been to rehab and worked extremely hard to clean his life up. He was a good person. And they were happy. Or so I thought. I found out, that same year, that my mom had been cheating. So, her boyfriend up and left. He moved back to his home state of Maryland, and I was sure I wouldn't see him again. I was already devastated, but to make matters worse, my mom started bringing her new boyfriend around. The one she had been cheating with. So, for obvious reasons, I didn't like him from the very first time I met him. Sadly, they stayed together for a while. Summer eventually came, the summer between my 5th and 6th grade years of school. The guy, Dan, would come over sometimes, but not too often. Then, my mom started to change. She quit her day job and started telling my sister and I that she wanted to start up her own cleaning business. We thought it was odd, considering she'd never shown interest in cleaning or running a business. But we didn't think anything was wrong about it. Not at first, anyway. My family of 3 depended on my mom's unemployment for a while. Dan started coming over more often, and when that happened, my mom would lock her door and ignore my sister and I. A fire ignited in my mom halfway through summer. She started getting business, and a lot of it. She would go clean 5 or 6 places in a day. I would go with her sometimes, and it was exhausting. Even for an 11-year-old. My mom would clean during the day, and then come home and answer emails, clean the house, and even partake in her new hobby, scrapbooking. She would be so busy doing all of this that she wouldn't even notice when the sun rose the next day. When she finally did, she would change and head out the door for work. It was a vicious cycle that began. At first, she would only skip sleep for a night. But 1 turned into 2, and 2 turned into 5. I started sleeping in my mom's bed because she never used it. Often, I would wake up and find her passed out with her head against the computer keyboard. She would have food spilled all over her, and the imprint of keys on her forehead. Sometimes I would fall asleep and she would wake me up halfway through the night and ask if I wanted to go out to eat. We had money, for the first time in my life. We weren't struggling. So, we would go out almost nightly and spend it. It sounds crazy, but at first I just thought my mom was a superhero. I didn't know about drugs, other than the fact that they were bad. Schools didn't teach about the drugs specifically, not in elementary school, anyway. My sister started refusing to be home. She would hang out with her boyfriend every day, but I didn't understand why. Our mom was great, I thought. In early August, my mom sat my sister and I down and told us that she was engaged to Dan. My sister was angry and they began to fight often. I thought it was fine, mainly because my mom didn't act like this until she started dating Dan. I thought it was a good thing. A few months passed like this. Even when summer ended, my mom stayed up all night working. It wasn't until we went camping that things changed. My mom promised a camping trip for just her, my sister, and I. No Dan. So we went. While there, my mom thought it would be funny to get my 16-year-old sister drunk. At first my sister was funny. She let us draw a mustache on her and made jokes. But then, she started crying and pleading for my mom to stop. I didn't get what she meant, but my mom started crying and promised she would. My mom stopped staying up all night after that, and I missed it. Dan didn't come around anymore either. It wasn't until a year later that I found out why. She told me that she had been addicted to cocaine and he was her dealer turned fiancé. She realized, after quitting, that she didn't love him. She loved the drug. After they broke up originally, he didn't handle it well. He would stalk my mom, come over and just sit outside. It was creepy. Looking back on Dan, he was a creepy guy. My mom once told me, after they broke up, that she'd seen pictures of a 20-something girl on his digital camera. Innocent pictures. Had Dan been related to her or knew her? They were just pictures of her bent over in a garden. But the thing is, Dan didn't know her. He was one of the reasons that we eventually moved from the house and into a new apartment. A while passed, and my mom ran into Dan at the grocery store. They were able to have a civil chat, and they caught up for a few minutes. My mom never told him where we lived though, she wasn't stupid. That night, we woke up to the sound of squeaking tires outside of the window. This was followed by screaming. Words like whore, slut, and bitch. Our neighbors called us, asking what was going on. My mom looked out the window to see none other than Dan, drunk off his ass. She decided to ignore him. I guess he had followed her home that night, and then gone to some bar, only to come back drunk. He left that night and my mom didn't think to call the cops. She'd tried before, but there was nothing they could do. So we just hoped he wouldn't come back. But lo and behold, he did. One night, my mom had a friend over. They went shopping together and came home to find Dan's car parked next to my mom's empty spot. There was nowhere else that she could possibly park, so she backed in and hoped for the best. Luckily, her friend was a guy and was sitting passenger seat, so Dan didn't have access to my mom like he probably wanted. My mom ran into the house, leaving the grocery bags in the car. We heard squealing again, but not nearly as much this time. The next morning, my mom and I went outside so she could drive me to school. We found that her windshield was cracked badly and there was spit stuck to her windshield. It was disgusting and I had to sit in the car, staring at it. My mother finally called the cops and they arrested Dan in a McDonald's bathroom after a high-speed chase. I don't remember what happened to him, but I know my mom got a restraining order. Other than him adding me on Facebook back in 2013, I haven't heard from Dan since then. When I got older, though, my mom did tell me that Dan didn't spit on the windshield, but it was actually his semen. He was a disgusting, drunk man. Dan, let's not meet again.